Good morning. I'm thinking this morning about the statement that I've heard on and off over the years that no matter how bad things get, the sun always comes up the next morning. And that's all I can think of this morning. Because the sun has come up, we've got some better weather, probably the best weather all week, so I'll be making one of the great SIFT trips later today, probably after I start uploading this thing. But oh man, I've gotten some feedback from my dad about what happened last night after I left, and it looks like it got worse. I picked the right time to cut out of there and go home. So it's the first time I ever left one of those things like that, so it's not a good thing, but it looks like the feeling is mutual. My dad and my stepmother watched everything go downhill after I left, so I have very high hopes that things will be notably different for Christmas next year. This is going to be a one-and-done type situation because, yeah, this can't happen again. So anyways, the sun has come up, it's time to move forward, and I will be working on Beyond 10 Years later this week because we have plenty of inclement weather coming up, including a snowstorm, for me to do so. So anyways, today I want to just talk a bit more about the big find yesterday, the Missal book, by the way, M-I-S-S-A-L, not to be confused with a nuclear missile. That was originally my mother's. I found out a few more things about it, and I actually have a couple of corrections to make. So, yeah, number one, I got my popes mixed up. See, I'm familiar with back to John Paul II, and John Paul II, I was a little kid. I was like, Pope John Paul II? Why does the Pope have two first names? Yeah, I was an idiot as a little kid, but Pope Pius. This book says some nice things about Pope Pius, but he was not the Pope before John Paul II. He was a Pope before John Paul II. There was a couple more between Pope Pius and John Paul II, but this book says nice things about Pope Pius and was originally published in 1959, which is roughly around the time that things were wrapping, roughly around the time that he, I don't think he died or something like that, but his papacy ended at the end of the 50s, I think. Did some reading on it earlier, but yeah, so here's the thing. This book was originally published in 1959, but if it's anything like, say, the Lutheran service book or some of the stuff I was talking about last time, the material was probably put together notably before then, and they ran the presses, printed it up, and stuff like that. So even though this was given to my mother during the time when Vatican II was in session, this was pre-Vatican II. And the materials are probably circa mid to late 50s. It's also interesting, I've done a little bit more, taking a look at this thing. It looks like, yes, this was originally my mother's, and it's got the pink paper and everything and stuff like that. It was originally my mother's, but both my mother and my father went through a rebellious phase after they got out on their own, where they abandoned elements of their childhood, like going, like religious observance and stuff like that. And they both came back later, of course, but it looks like this went to my uncle, her much younger brother, at some point later on. So it's the only book I've ever read where over in the dedication section it says, "To Mike on her confirmation." So it looks like she went off to do her own thing. This wound up back with my grandparents. They gave it to her brother. I remember he was a big hippie and stuff like that. My dad knew him a bit, way back in the day. And so he went all hippie and stuff, I think. And then this wound up back with my grandparents, and then later in life, my mother got back into getting involved in the church and stuff. She probably got this back. This wound up with her things when she died, and that's why I have it today. So, even though it says "to Mike" on her confirmation, this was originally from my mother when she was confirmed in the early 1960s, and I ran the numbers that would place her at roughly middle school age or so, which is right on par with when confirmations usually happen in these traditions. Among the Lutherans, it's the same way. The confirmands are usually middle school age or so. For those of you that don't know what a confirmation is, it's when the church considers you old enough to basically know what the heck is going on in the service and things like that, and know what the heck you're doing. So there's a Protestant version of this too there's a Protestant version referred to as the Age of Accountability. and stuff along those lines. So basically, it's when you start being considered a member of the church, even if you're still growing up in your parents' household. It's when you're old enough to understand what the heck's going on and things like that. Usually you've gone through catechism and things along those lines. But this has been such an eye-opener as to just where the seriousness and the sternness of my mother and my grandparents came from, because this is the environment that they were raised in. Very, very fascinating stuff, even though, there is a modern Roman Missal, but I'm very tempted. The church that issued this is still around up in Massachusetts. It'd be funny if I made a road trip up there and showed up to Mass with this thing. See what the priest has to say. What? 1959? What the heck? You can tell its age here, because look what was being used as a bookmark. Remembrance of my first Holy Communion, Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church, May 25th, 1958. We're definitely going back for this, but knowing how these things go together, then this is definitely pre-Vatican II, which explains a ton about how the folks on my mother's side of the family were with this sort of stuff. Way more serious, and of course the stuff that's supposed to be like a walkthrough of what's what in the Mass, it's got Latin and English side by side, so. There might have been a service completely, there might have been a Mass done in Latin, and it would be, and here's what it means. So, some of that stuff, things like that. Hey, consecration of the wine. We must be at the communion section of it or something. But I got to do some more reading of this, because there's probably going to be more eye-openers as to why her and her family were the way they were as I read more of this stuff. Just to see what's going on, and compare it with the stuff I've worked with over the years as well. So, yeah, my mother went through a rebellion phase, then came back to the church later in life, got very serious about it. That's when I was dragged as a little kid. And I understand that's actually not a very strange thing to have happen here in New England, because there's a ton of Catholicism here in the Northeast. And in the third wave Protestant evangelical background, the context that I grew up in, after my mother passed away and I was involved more in churches my dad would have gone to, then I actually ran into more than a few people that wound up in our churches that grew up Catholic and went through something like this. And then, but once they went to a contemporary service with a full band, rousing hymns and worship music, and not even hymns, but modern worship songs and stuff, they're like, oh yeah, I wish I could have grown up in this and stuff like that. But what's really interesting is when you look at how these two types of organizations do things, there's more common ground between Protestants and Catholics than you would think. It's crazy. It's almost like the Protestants have recreated a lot of more Roman type stuff, and there's people going the other way too. People are catching on to this, and they wind up back in some kind of Catholic church afterwards. So it's really bizarre, comparing how folks do things and why certain things happen out there and things like that. But it'll be very, very interesting for me to read through this a little more and just compare and get some insight into what my mother grew up in and eventually went back to, and why things were the way they were when I was little and didn't have a clue what was going on at the time. Yeah, 1958. I'm also still very, very surprised that this book's in the shape that it's in, considering its age, because I actually have some books from the 40s and 30s that are yellowed all to heck and stuff like that. Maybe it's because this was in storage for many years, but it wasn't really exposed to light too much. So maybe it was just built to last. I mean, here's the thing. It used to be the case that when you joined a church as a member, you got a hymnal, because hymnals weren't just songbooks. They had the orders of all the services, devotional material, there were the Psalms, and there were some other stuff you could read as well. But nowadays you find these things in the pews at these places. So same thing with the Missal. I've been to a couple of Catholic churches, visited a few over the years, and these things are in the pews nowadays. But my mom got her start in a day and age where you became a full-blown member of the church. You got one of these things to bring back and forth. So, and it definitely has some signs of wear and whatnot. I mean, this thing is totally cracked all to heck, and there's some of the stitching coming loose and things like that. But the book otherwise is in pretty decent shape. I tried taking the plastic cover off, but it's glued on over here. And this is right in line, actually, with the modern equivalent to these things, usually in some kind of clear coat jacket like this, although not with a button to keep them closed. But yeah, the rainbow color bookmark, although I was looking at a how-to for the modern Roman Missal, It looks like there's no real what color goes to what, but the Treasury of Daily Prayer among the Lutherans, actually there is something that each of these colors goes to. Yeah, point the camera the right direction there, buddy. There is something that each of these goes to. I'd have to look it up. Obviously, I'm doing everything wrong, but then again, this book is supposed to be kept open at home all the time, and you're flipping between the bookmarks every single day for stuff. So yeah, I am kind of screwing things up with this, but that's why I made the connection between these two types of books, is because very worn out rainbow bookmarks versus... I can get a new one of these too. This thing is so worn and frayed that I actually have bits and pieces, like little bird feathers and stuff flaking off, and I'm finding them places now because they fly around and settle down somewhere. But yeah, this thing is very heavily used, so it's giving me some great insight as to the environment my mother grew up in. Now, so let's consider, this is meant to keep things orderly. You know what's going to happen when you go to a service, or mass, excuse me. You know what's where, you know what to pray, you know what the readings are for the week. This is meant to keep things orderly, keep things going by the book, so to speak. Now, let's compare what I went through with my background growing up. And actually, yeah, my mother and the strictness of my relatives on that side of the family. That is 12:05 a.m. It's not morning anymore. My mother and the strictness of my relatives on that side of the family is in sharp contrast to the more laid-back, humorous attitude of folks from my dad's side of the family, and church involvement was no exception. They were more Protestant. My grandmother was a Methodist, and my dad actually is why I grew up in a third wave context. Type third wave evangelicalism into Wikipedia if you want. But here's my answer to what Mom brought back and forth. A big Bible. Yeah, we were very heavily influenced by the Deep South, which is why I extended some sympathy to people in that part of the country who maybe they're getting their door knocked on by people trying to twist their arm and get them to go to some kind of service and whatnot. But me, I say, if you're going to get involved with a belief system of any sort, actually like it first. Don't go through the motions. Don't fake it. Don't half-ass it. But we are very heavily influenced by the Deep South. We had 2 pastors from Alabama, for crying out loud. So, yeehaw! Bring a big, huge Bible to church and stuff like that. So, the thing with this is a bit more orderly. This was a bit more orderly. It told you what was what in the service. It told you what to read, what to pray, things like that. Very much kind of like I wouldn't say user's manual, but kind of like a how-to and whatnot. Very structured versus this. So, this is actually the Bible I had growing up, my fundamentalist Bible, as I call it, and I got to be extremely careful where I turn. I'm going to do this off camera, actually. I got to be extremely careful where I turn in this, because I was writing notes in the margins that were pretty nasty. Some of them named names and called people out and stuff like that. Oh, man. What happened was pooled ignorance. Things were really stupid. It was basically pooled ignorance. So, where's a good one for this? Nineveh, city of blood, is ruined. Yeah. Let's see if we can find something positive in here somewhere. There's something to open the darn book to. Oh, yeah, God lowers the boom. Yeah, what a mess that was. Okay, Psalm 109, kind of imprecatory in nature. Don't overlook his sins. Here's the thing. Note the massive difference here. Here I was just out of control. I would have already been amped up just because I was a teenager at the time because of the hormones. Never mind that nobody was pulling the reins on me when I went overboard with all the wrong stuff and being militantly wrong about things. So I went to a Pentecostal church growing up. My dad got involved in the Assemblies of God when his rebellion phase was over, and I got a couple of pages folding into each other, and it's I wound up in the Pentecostal context growing up, which here in the Northeast is not as wound up as maybe in some areas of the South. So more influence from the third wave. Full band, but not as crazy with the songs and stuff like that. But he wound up in the Assemblies of God, and eventually we wound up in similar contexts around here and stuff like that. But I was just out of control as a teenager, getting things wrong, doing things wrong, and nobody was pulling the reins on me. Because I looked like I was super serious and extreme, as the youth group folks would say, nobody really questioned or tried to stop me when I was doing things wrong all over the place. Like, I thought I was smart because I carried a big Bible to church every Sunday. Yeehaw! No. This is a parallel Bible. It's got the King James, which to this day is still idolized by certain groups of people out there. It's got the Thee, Thy, Thou, Shakespearean English King James, and then the Living Bible, which I was like, it's plain English! Yay, cool! This is going to tell me what the King James says. Wrong. It left me to my own devices to be very, very wrong about things and not properly interpret stuff. Plus, this is a paraphrase. This was written in the 70s-ish, and it's very loosey-goosey. Nowadays, I remember the paraphrase ice cold, and I have to cross-reference it in Google search to find where stuff is, because I remember the paraphrase, and the paraphrase doesn't word things anywhere close to today's plain English translations. So I thought I was smart, but I wasn't. All I had was more versions of the same text for me to misinterpret. So my mother had it a lot more orderly than I did growing up. Of course, nowadays, you're not going to find this stuff because ebooks are a thing. People probably have 70 Bibles on their phone or something. Ultimately, when I started mellowing out, but I still did the same things wrong, I graduated to a 4-translation parallel. Oh, like the beginning of the Psalms, but at least I don't have super judgmental notes in the margins in this like I did growing up as a teenager. So, okay, King James, New King James, slightly less thee, thy, thous. NIV, the 1984 version, not the politically correct one that recently came out, and the New Living Translation, the attempt to formalize the Living Bible paraphrase. But this is just more of the same. It's more of the same kinds of problems. No scholarship, no direction, nobody to direct me in making proper use of the texts. I was left to my own devices, and I only made bigger versions of the same old mistakes. Plus, you had to read this from top to bottom and then turn the page, because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, top to bottom, turn the page, top to bottom, turn the page, top to bottom, turn the page. But this brought me no closer to having any clue what I was doing, just that I would make the same mistakes, only bigger. So, yeah, I have an extra one of these that's in near mint condition, but I don't want to give this to just anybody, because I don't want anybody making the same mistakes I did, and I'm hard-pressed to find any clergy that actually want one of these things. So I would only really give it to a member of the clergy, someone with some formal background in this stuff that wouldn't make the same mistakes that I did. But there's nobody really wants 4 translations at once when you can get eSword and load it up with plugins in this day and age, so waste of like $60, $70 back in the 2000s and whatnot. That finally was solved for me with the Lutheran Study Bible. Reformation Day 2009, I was getting into more Reformed type stuff. Ultimately wound up Lutheran instead of Calvinist, but here's the difference. One translation, the ESV, and actual context and cross-reference material. So actually some intellectual stuff to go along with the stuff that's actually that I'm looking at. Little things written in here and there, little blurbs and things to add some context to things, and most importantly, cross-referencing interpretation, folks with some actual formal education chiming in on things, as well as what they all relate to here. Here's something that is very common in this book. Here is 2 Corinthians chapter 1, one of Paul's letters to the early church. The first third of the page is the actual text. The bottom 2/3 is context material. And it's all coded up and everything. Look, next page, same exact stuff. Text, context. This is what I was missing growing up. And this is one of those things where I was like, where was this stuff my whole life? So I felt like a moron. Like Plato's torpedo fish. I think I'm getting smart, but I'm actually getting stupid. Oh, be careful. So I got another one of these somewhere that was... no, I think I gave that one away, but I donated it to the last church that I was involved with that needed more of these things. But yeah, so Lutheran Study Bible, it's not a denominational thing either. There's an ESV one that's non-denominational too. I spilled something on this one at one point. Thank goodness for the cover. Here's the non-denominational ESV one. Folks from various traditions contributed to the notes in this one. But the point is... Ooh, Zephaniah. Woohoo! I guess on there, it has context material. It has little color illustrations and things like that. Oh, there we go. Hey, look, Jerusalem. That is Jerusalem. No, that's Temple Mount back in those days. So it's got color illustrations, the whole 9 yards, but most importantly, context material. if I'd had this stuff growing up, it would have been a very, very different adolescence for me, because I would have actually had some order to what it is that I did, as someone that could pull the reins on me, kind of like my mother did all those years ago. Today, instead of lugging something back and forth, the Lutherans split everything off. Treasury of Daily Prayer is a flippy, floppy, almost but not quite soft cover book that's made to stay open with the bookmarks at various pages, with stuff for at-home devotional stuff every day of the year, so to speak. Then you head out to an actual service, you'll find these in the pews, which are made to basically stay there, although I have a pew version at home just to have a clue what some of the stuff they're singing was, what the order of service was, and things like that. But look at this, daily prayer for individuals and families. So this harkens back to people join a church formally and they get one of these to take home. Yeah, see all that? There you go. Morning and evening, what to do with the family and whatnot. And there's more books like this too. A daily lectionary and things along those lines. So it's not just a songbook. There's even weddings and funerals in here. So I can know for certain that if I got married in one of these places, this is what it would be like. If there's a funeral in one of those places, oh look, Divine Service setting 4. I think I've been through a few of those. But here's what's going to be in the darn services and where it all comes from. The references to where in the texts everything comes from. The music for everything, the whole 9 yards. Everything's orderly. But traditionally, this is not that expensive. There's Bibles that cost more than those things. So, anyways, so these two combined together are basically the answer to what Mom took back and forth back in those days when Vatican II was still getting argued out. And that's why this is such a massive eye-opener of a book. Despite the fact that I probably, oh, the chair's creaking again, I just sprayed silicone spray on the darn thing 3 days ago and it's already dried out. I'm going to have to get some real oil for it. But, this order and everything. This order and this being essentially the manual for how you conduct yourself as you go about your business, both inside and outside of any services. This is just such an eye-opener as to the kind of environment she grew up in, why she was the way she was, why my grandparents were the way they were, and just what's changed as things have lightened up over the decades and whatnot. Some of what I see today when I visit some of those places, I think my grandparents would be appalled to see some of it. And even my mother, if she were still around, she'd be like, why the heck is there a band in a Catholic church with decorations and stuff that, look way older than the folks with the guitars and the drums in the front? So, I gotta read more of this. It's going to be such an eye-opener to learn about this family history and whatnot. I may not agree with everything that's in there, with everything that's in here, but I need to at least have an open mind to get a little insight into what exactly has gone on and what sort of environment that she grew up in, what sort of environment my family was accustomed to, this sort of stuff, and just what has changed since then. So, and of course the 50s book thing with the thicker photo paper and then the thinner stuff in the middle, and the fact that it hasn't yellowed or anything. It's really an eye-opener. You know what? I've got some other old books that are in nowhere near as good a shape. Let's round out this vlog by getting some of them. Here we go. These should be good examples. A lot of these are from childhood. Why I still have them, I don't know. But just look at them. Versus So I guess there's something with the paper there because that thing was made to last. But here's some kind of history of Connecticut. When was it written? Charles Scribner, supervising agent for the Connecticut State Board of Education, 1908 to 1930. I'll be very careful with this. 1932 to 1943, 30s and 40s. To the boys and girls of Connecticut, here in your hands you hold the book that sings 300 years of toil, blah, 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 blah. First settlement, this is kind of like a Connecticut. Oh, look, Indians, English, and Dutch. This book is a product of its time. The story of King Philip, the American Revolution, industries and manufacturing, the industrial era, why the faded mill towns nowadays are faded, So, not a little bit older than that book, but notably horrible condition. Logan Clendening, The Human Body. Oh, look at that. This is more yellow. This was yellowed already when I looked at it as a kid. Now it's even worse. Wow, it's got to be something with the paper. 1927 to 1930 by Alfred A. Knopf, Incorporated. This thing is contemporary to the Depression. Ooh, the digestive system. Let's see, the birth of percussion, circulatory system, and stuff like that. As I was looking through this, any book we could get at a yard sale I was reading as a little kid. So, hey, look, blood pressure. Circa the Great Depression. A little bit older, but in much worse condition. Nations Beyond the Seas, The Earth and Its People, Atwood Thomas. I think I've seen some newer stuff from them. But look at it, British Lands in Asia. And here's where you have some of the leafing and stuff like that, where the better paper has the color stuff. Ooh, Town of Orange. It's been out of that part of Connecticut for how long? Copyright 1930. So this is actually a textbook. The British Isles, British Lands in Asia. Oh look, India as a British colony. Australia, France, a review of the British Empire. Yeah, this is circa the Depression. And then there's the Circle of Knowledge, a classified, simplified, visualized book of answers. Again, look at how old this is. 1934. I'm not going to show those names though. Let's see what we got here. Oh, look at that. Someone tried to tape it with cellophane tape years and years and years and years and years and years and years ago, 1934. Okay, maybe these are older, but 1930s, a little less yellowed based on the paper and stuff like that. Oh, look, from the founding of the German Empire to the close of the European War and the reconstruction of Europe. Yeah, this book is contemporary to Weimar, Germany, before the Nazis took over. Wow. Living nations of the world today, but it's all yellowed and stuff. I gotta find a book that's more like the 1950s or so, because these are all Depression era books. Why I still have them, I don't know. They're rotting away on my shelf, and well, don't really know what to do with them, but it's hilarious to look back and read some of this stuff from that time period. But yeah, okay, this is late 1950s. Do I have something? I don't think I do. Let me take another look at the shelf. Nope. Close, but no cigar. The closest I have that's contemporary to this thing is actually a little too late. This is a physics book that we got at some yard sale somewhere because I liked reading old books and stuff. Late 60s, early 70s. And I think it does come down to the paper, though. Look, you have some old highlighting from someone who used this in college. 4186 Joules, KC01. That's not my handwriting, by the way. This was a college book in the 70s. But here's the kicker with all of this, though. You got all of this going on. Look at this yellowed old dictionary. This is in rough shape, very rough shape. I think it does come down to the paper that's used in these books, though. This is in very rough shape. This is from the 1990s. It was a gift from my middle school as I was going into high school for doing so well. And I was joking, and I was actually joking because it's an unabridged dictionary. I was joking as an adolescent about how I was going home at night and looking up swears in the dictionary. Hey, there's even the F-bomb is in here too. So it just has the tag that says that it's vulgar. Oh man, yeah. So it does come down to the paper, I think, and what was used and how well it was made and with how long it was supposed to last. 1990s, this goes obsolete pretty quickly. I mean, selfies probably in the dictionary nowadays, but this is the circa the 1990s, that's circa the 1970s, and that's circa the late 50s. So, excuse me, I think it all boils down to the paper that's used and things like that. So, a little bit of old books to round out the vlogs here before I go make the great SIF trip and stuff like that. Very, very interesting and very, very fascinating. This old Missal book from the late 1950s that's still in as great a shape as it is versus some of the other books that I have. Well. This is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.